It's the year 325 AD in Nicaea, a city in modern-day Turkey. 300 bishops gather in an opulent palace hall summoned by Constantine, the first Roman emperor to claim Christianity. They're not there to feed the poor or heal the sick. They're debating the precise nature of Christ's divinity, crafting creeds, establishing hierarchies, building what will become one of the most powerful institutional machines in human history. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, a small group of believers meets in a cramped room above a baker's shop. They share bread, pool their meager earnings to help a widow whose husband died of fever, and sing hymns that would get them executed if the wrong person heard. They own no property. They have no priests. They follow a collection of letters and stories about a man who owned nothing, commanded no armies, and died the death of a criminal. Two versions of the same faith, separated not by geography but by something far more profound. Here's what almost nobody tells you. For the first 300 years after Jesus died, Christianity had no Bible as we know it. No centralized authority, no grand cathedrals, no political power. What it had were dangerous memories of a man who said the last shall be first, who touched lepers, who told a rich young ruler to sell everything, who overturned tables in the temple and called religious leaders whitewashed tombs. And then something happened. The faith of the persecuted became the faith of the persecutors. The movement of the powerless became the ally of emperors, and in that transformation, something was gained but something precious was also lost. What would Christianity actually look like if we stripped away 2,000 years of institutional development and returned to the raw, unfiltered teachings of the Jewish rabbi from Nazareth? Not the Jesus of stained glass windows and marble statues, but the Jesus of dusty roads and borrowed boats? Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig beneath the surface of history to find the truths that institutions would rather we forget. Before we go further, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Drop a comment below. I love seeing how this community spans every time zone and continent. Let's start with something that will shock most Christians. Jesus never asked anyone to build a church building. In fact, the entire New Testament contains exactly 0 instructions for constructing religious architecture. The Greek word that gets translated as church, ecclesia, literally means called out ones, or assembly. It's a term for people, not buildings. The earliest Christians met in homes, and they met there for nearly 3 centuries. The first known purpose-built church structure dates to around 241 AD in Dura Europos, Syria, and even that was just a converted house with one wall knocked down. The Apostle Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, was a tent maker. He worked with his hands and explicitly refused payment for his preaching, writing to the Corinthians, "I have coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. These hands have provided for my necessities." Yet today, church construction is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The Crystal Cathedral in California cost over $18 million in 1980. St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City? Its construction nearly bankrupted the Catholic Church and required the sale of indulgences, which directly triggered the Protestant Reformation. Jesus himself said, "Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." He was itinerant, propertyless, dependent on the hospitality of others. His ministry wasn't based in a building, but on roads, hillsides, borrowed upper rooms, and the shores of a lake. Now, let's talk about money, because this is where the contrast becomes almost unbearable. In Luke 14, Jesus tells a parable about a great banquet where the host invites the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. In Matthew 19, he tells a wealthy young man, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." In Acts 2, the earliest Christian community had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. The Roman Catholic Church alone owns an estimated 177 million acres of land worldwide, making it one of the largest property owners on earth. The Church of England has assets worth approximately £10 billion. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has an investment portfolio valued at over $100 billion. These aren't criticisms of financial management. They're observations about how far the institution has drifted from the founder's explicit teachings. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus watches people putting money into the temple treasury. The rich put in large sums, but a poor widow puts in 2 copper coins worth less than a penny. Jesus tells his disciples, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those contributing to the treasury. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." 24 hours later, as they're leaving the temple, his disciples marvel at the magnificent buildings. Jesus responds with words that must have seemed insane. "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down." He wasn't impressed by architectural grandeur. He was moved by radical generosity from the powerless. Here's another fact that rarely gets mentioned. Jesus spent far more time criticizing religious leaders than he did criticizing anyone else. The prostitutes and tax collectors, he ate with them. The Roman occupiers, he told his followers to go the extra mile when compelled to carry their packs. But the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious establishment, he called them hypocrites, blind guides, serpents, a brood of vipers. In Matthew 23, he unleashes a devastating 7-part condemnation. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." They were meticulous about religious rules but ignored justice. They loved the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues. They made their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. In other words, they performed religion while missing its heart entirely. Flash forward to medieval Europe. The Catholic Church owned between 1/4 and 1/3 of all land. Cardinals lived in palaces. Popes commanded armies. The clergy were exempt from most civil laws. Bishops held feudal power over vast territories. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated that all Christians confess to a priest at least once a year, creating a system of spiritual control unimaginable in the early church. The sale of indulgences became so corrupt that Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar, reportedly claimed, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." This is what Jesus would have overturned tables about. But here's where it gets even more interesting. What if I told you that some of Christianity's most treasured doctrines were decided by political vote? The Council of Nicaea in 325 didn't just happen because bishops felt like having a theological discussion. Constantine called it because the empire was fracturing over doctrinal disputes, particularly about the nature of Christ. Was he fully divine? Was he created by God the Father? The Arian controversy threatened to split the empire. The bishops voted. The Nicene Creed was born not from divine revelation, but from majority consensus, enforced by imperial authority. Those who disagreed were exiled. Arius himself was banished. His books were burned. This pattern repeated at council after council. Ephesus in 431, Chalcedon in 451, Constantinople multiple times. Doctrines were debated, voted on, enforced with the power of the state. Jesus held no councils. He established no voting procedures. He wrote no systematic theology. He told stories about seeds and sheep, threw parties with outcasts, and washed his disciples' feet. Let me share something that might make you uncomfortable. In the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus gives what many scholars consider the core of his ethical teaching. He says to turn the other cheek when struck, to love your enemies, to pray for those who persecute you, to give to everyone who asks, not to store up treasures on earth, not to judge others, not to worry about tomorrow, to enter through the narrow gate because broad is the road that leads to destruction. These aren't suggestions. The Greek text uses imperative verbs, they're commands. Within 3 centuries of Jesus' death, Christianity became the official religion of Rome under Theodosius Masinmadius in 380 AD. Christians who had been fed to lions now fed their theological opponents to the machinery of state persecution. The Edict of Thessalonica made Christianity mandatory. Pagan temples were destroyed. Heretics were executed. By 416 AD, non-Christians were banned from serving in the Roman military. The Prince of Peace became the mascot of empire. If you enjoy this kind of deep historical investigation, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue researching and producing content that challenges conventional narratives. The institutional church developed elaborate hierarchies: deacons, priests, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, popes. The Eastern Orthodox developed their own parallel structure with patriarchs. Later, Protestant denominations created their own variations: pastors, elders, superintendents, moderators, overseers. But Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 23, "You are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant." The early church took this seriously. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul describes the church as a body with many parts, each equally necessary. In Galatians 3:28, he writes, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." The emphasis was on mutual service, not hierarchical control. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian documents outside the New Testament, probably written around 50 to 120 AD, gives instructions for communal life. Traveling prophets are welcomed, but if they stay more than 3 days or ask for money, they're false prophets. Leaders are to be chosen from among the community. Everything is practical, grounded, humble. Contrast this with Pope Innocent III, who in 1198 declared himself lower than God but higher than man. Or the doctrine of papal infallibility, formally defined in 1870, which claims that the Pope cannot err when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals. Jesus, who called himself the Son of Man and frequently emphasized his own dependence on the Father, never claimed infallibility. Let's talk about what Jesus actually spent his time doing. According to the Gospels, he healed the sick constantly. He cast out demons. He fed hungry crowds. He spent time with people considered unclean: lepers, menstruating women, corpses, Gentiles, Samaritans. In Luke 4, at the very beginning of his ministry, he reads from Isaiah in the synagogue, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed." This was his mission statement. Not to establish denominations or debate transubstantiation or develop systematic theology. To proclaim good news to the poor and liberty to the oppressed. In James 1:27, Jesus' brother writes, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." That's the entire definition. Not right doctrine, not proper liturgy, not ecclesiastical authority. Care for the vulnerable and personal integrity. Here's a fact that will disturb many. Jesus never told anyone to spread Christianity as a religion. The Great Commission in Matthew 28, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations," is about making disciples, people who follow Jesus' way of life, not about creating Christian civilization or Christendom. The word Christian appears only 3 times in the entire New Testament, and always as a term used by outsiders. The early believers called themselves followers of the way. When Christianity became institutionalized, the way became the church. Following became belonging. Practice became doctrine. A movement became an organization. The Crusades were launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, promising spiritual rewards for military conquest. Thousands marched under the cross to slaughter Muslims and Jews in the Holy Land. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 didn't even make it to the Holy Land, but instead sacked Constantinople, a Christian city. Crusaders raped, murdered, and looted fellow Christians while wearing the symbol of the man who said to love your enemies. The Inquisition tortured and executed thousands for heresy. The Catholic Church supported the transatlantic slave trade with papal bulls like Dum Diversas in 1452, granting Portugal the right to enslave non-Christians. Protestant churches in America used the Bible to justify slavery and segregation well into the 20th century. None of this is compatible with love your neighbor as yourself or blessed are the merciful. But it is compatible with institutional power seeking to preserve itself. What profession are you in, by the way? I'm always fascinated by the diverse backgrounds of people who end up interested in these historical deep dives. Drop a comment and let me know. Now, imagine a version of Christianity that actually followed Jesus. What would it look like? It would be radically nonviolent. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when Peter draws a sword to defend Jesus, Jesus rebukes him. Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. For the first 3 centuries, Christians were predominantly pacifist. They refused to serve in the Roman military. Church fathers like Tertullian and Origen wrote against Christian participation in warfare. Justin Martyr, writing around 150 AD, said, "We who formerly murdered one another now not only do not make war upon our enemies, but that we may not lie or deceive, willingly die confessing Christ." After Constantine, everything changed. By 416 AD, only Christians could serve in the military. Augustine of Hippo developed the just war theory to justify Christian violence. The religion of the martyrs became the religion of the empire's soldiers. A Jesus-centered Christianity would be economically radical. The early Jerusalem church practiced economic sharing so thoroughly that Acts 4:34 reports there was not a needy person among them. When Ananias and Sapphira held back money from the common fund, they died, not because they didn't give everything, but because they lied about it. The expectation of radical generosity was that strong. The monastic movements tried to recapture this. Francis of Assisi in the 13th century renounced his wealthy family, stripped naked in the town square, and devoted himself to poverty. The Franciscan order he founded was supposed to own nothing, individually or collectively. Within a century, the order was embroiled in disputes about whether they could even own the buildings they lived in. The institutional impulse toward accumulation proved too strong. The Anabaptists in the 16th century attempted to return to early Christian economic practices. The Hutterites established communities of goods. They were slaughtered by the thousands by both Catholic and Protestant authorities. Menno Simons, founder of the Mennonites, wrote that true Christians do not seek worldly gain, riches, and honor. Both groups survive today as small, often marginalized communities. A Jesus-following Christianity would embrace radical inclusion. Jesus' most controversial act wasn't his miracles. It was his table fellowship. He ate with tax collectors and sinners. In first-century Jewish culture, sharing a meal was an intimate act of acceptance and fellowship. The Pharisees were scandalized, asking, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus responded, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." The woman caught in adultery? "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." The Samaritan woman at the well with 5 former husbands? He talks theology with her and reveals himself as the Messiah. The Roman centurion? Jesus marvels at his faith. The Syrophoenician woman? After initially refusing, he heals her daughter. Contrast this with churches that have excluded people based on race, requiring separate congregations well into the 1970s and 80s. Churches that exclude women from leadership despite the fact that women were the first witnesses to the resurrection. And Paul worked alongside female co-workers like Priscilla, Junia, and Phoebe, whom he called a deacon. Churches that exclude LGBTQ individuals, though Jesus himself said nothing recorded about homosexuality while saying volumes about welcoming outcasts. It would prioritize love over law. When asked what the greatest commandment was, Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Everything else, every other rule, hangs on these two. Paul echoes this in Romans 13:10. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Yet institutional Christianity has often done the opposite, creating ever more elaborate rule systems while neglecting the fundamental call to love. The Pharisees had 613 commandments derived from the Torah. The Catholic Church's Code of Canon Law contains 1,752 canons. The Presbyterian Book of Order runs hundreds of pages. The Southern Baptist Convention has detailed doctrinal statements on everything from eschatology to gender roles. All of this while Jesus reduced everything to two commandments and told stories about grace. A Christianity based on Jesus rather than institutions would be profoundly anti-authoritarian. In Mark 10, James and John ask to sit at Jesus' right and left hand in glory. The other disciples become indignant. Jesus calls them together and says, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all." Leadership as servanthood. Authority as service. This is the opposite of the papal throne, the episcopal palace, the megachurch pastor's mansion. Jesus washed feet. He carried no staff, wore no special robes, accepted no titles. When people tried to make him king by force, he withdrew. It would be intellectually humble. Jesus taught in parables, open-ended stories that invited interpretation. He asked questions constantly. Who do you say that I am? What do you think? Which of these three proved to be a neighbor? He never wrote a systematic theology. He never defined precise doctrinal boundaries. He told stories about seeds and invited people to follow. The institutional church has done the opposite, defining everything with increasing precision. The Westminster Confession runs to 33 chapters with detailed specifications on everything from predestination to church censures. The 39 Articles of the Anglican Church, the Augsburg Confession, the Council of Trent, the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, all attempting to nail down exactly what must be believed. Meanwhile, Jesus said, "Unless you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Children don't have systematic theology. They have trust. Here's perhaps the most challenging aspect. A Jesus-centered Christianity would be comfortable with ambiguity and failure. Jesus' own ministry ended in apparent catastrophe. He was executed as a criminal. His disciples scattered. Peter denied him 3 times. Thomas doubted. Everyone failed. And yet, the resurrection appearances are full of grace. Jesus doesn't rebuke the fleeing disciples. He doesn't shame Peter or Thomas. He eats breakfast with them on the beach. He asks Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times, paralleling the 3 denials, offering restoration instead of condemnation. The institutional church has often been terrible at this. Failures are covered up. Abuse is hidden. Mistakes are denied. The structures must be protected at all costs. When the Catholic sex abuse scandals emerged, the institutional response was to protect the institution, moving abusive priests rather than protecting victims. Protestant megachurches have done the same, circling wagons around powerful leaders rather than pursuing justice for the harmed. Jesus would have overturned those tables too. So what would it actually look like to follow Jesus rather than Christian institutions? It might look like the Catholic worker movement, founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin in 1933. Houses of hospitality for the poor. Radical pacifism. No fundraising or endowments. Communities living in voluntary poverty to serve those in need. Day wrote, "The only solution is love, and love comes with community." It might look like the simple church movement in China, where millions of Christians meet in homes, share resources, and maintain no property or professional clergy. Despite, or perhaps because of, government persecution, it's one of the fastest growing Christian movements in the world. It might look like Shane Claiborne's Simple Way community in Philadelphia, living in an abandoned neighborhood, sharing resources, practicing hospitality, deliberately choosing proximity to poverty rather than isolation and comfort. It might look like the work of Father Greg Boyle with Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, employing former gang members, offering radical grace, refusing to give up on anyone. Boyle writes, "Here is what we seek, a compassion that can stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it." All of these exist at the margins of institutional Christianity, often despite rather than because of official church support. They're small, they're vulnerable, they own little, they have no political power. They look a lot like the movement Jesus started. The tragedy is that Jesus gave us something beautiful and dangerous, a call to radical love, enemy-embracing forgiveness, voluntary poverty, servanthood, and self-sacrifice. We turned it into Christendom, an empire, a set of institutions that accumulated wealth and power and defended themselves with the sword he told us to put away. This isn't to say that institutions are all bad. They've preserved texts, created hospitals and universities, fed millions, provided community and meaning for billions across 2 millennia. The monks who copied manuscripts, the nuns who ran leprosariums, the circuit riders who brought literacy to the frontier, the liberation theologians who stood with the oppressed, all of these operated within institutional frameworks. But the question remains, what was lost in the translation from movement to institution? What would Christianity look like if we actually tried to follow the man instead of managing the organization? Here's what I think. It would be smaller but deeper, poorer but more generous, less certain but more faithful. It would care more about the widow and the orphan than about the budget and the building. It would wash feet instead of seeking thrones. It would tell stories instead of enforcing creeds. It would break bread with outcasts instead of building walls. It would give away power instead of accumulating it. It would look like a ragtag band of fishermen and tax collectors, women and children, slaves and free, Jew and Gentile, all trying to love God and neighbor, all failing regularly, all receiving grace, all invited to the table. It would look less like a cathedral and more like a loaves and fishes picnic on a hillside. Less like a denominational headquarters and more like an upper room where people wash each other's feet. Less like a television broadcast and more like a conversation between friends. The historical record is clear. Jesus built no buildings, commanded no armies, accumulated no wealth, established no hierarchy, wrote no creeds, and founded no institution. He walked dusty roads with a group of nobodies, told stories about seeds and sheep, ate with the wrong people, touched the untouchable, and died like a criminal with a promise of resurrection. Everything else is what we built on top of that. Some of it beautiful, some of it terrible, much of it complicated, but if we're honest, most of it would be unrecognizable to the Jewish rabbi from Nazareth who said the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds that grows into a tree where birds make their nests.